Hello, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. I'm Eric Siegel. I'm chair of the club's Personal Growth Forum and your host for today. We also welcome our listening audience, and we invite everyone to visit us online at commonwealthclub.org. Michael Shermer, founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine, has spoken to the club before about false narratives and irrational beliefs. He's just published a new book, Truth, and is therefore returning to our podium to talk about the concept of truth. After all, there are scientific truths, religious truths, historical truths, mythical truths, and more. In our current swamp of misinformation and disinformation and truthiness and rewritten history, conspiracy theories, fake news, bald-faced lies, etc., how do we discern actual facts and truth? And what is truth anyway? The Declaration of Independence claims that, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And what about those truths? And these questions are crucial if we're to have any kind of a functioning democracy. Dr. Shermer is going to tackle these issues with us. He'll clarify the different kinds of truths, take us on an entertaining ride through some classic fallacies, and then show us how to figure out, within the context of various types of truth, whether a particular fact is, in fact, factual. He's even promised maybe a few experiential exercises.
What? Okay.
That's truth. You don't have to.
We'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes. Dr. Shermer has the perfect background for this talk. He was the co-host and co-producer of the 13-hour Family Channel television series, Exploring the Unknown. His 2 TED Talks, seen by millions, were voted in the top 100. And he also found time to create Skeptic Magazine and write over 200 monthly columns for Scientific American, 20 best-selling books, and some audio classes from the great courses such as Skepticism 101, How to Think Like a Scientist, and Conspiracies and Conspiracy Theories, and more. He received a BA in psychology and an MA in experimental psychology, along with a PhD in the history of science. He's been a college professor and a professional ultramarathon bicycle racer since 1979. Indeed, he is a founder of the 3,000-mile transcontinental bicycle race across America. Now, it's my pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California our speaker, Dr. Michael Shermer.
Thank you so much. Would you like this back? Or should I keep it? That copy of Skeptic Magazine I gave you, hand that back to me just briefly so I can introduce that. Hi, everyone. That reminds me of the gavel of the story of the neophyte that goes to visit the rancher, and he explains to the neophyte that, how they castrate the bulls with 2 bricks. And the neophyte says, oh my God, doesn't that hurt? And he goes, not if you keep your thumbs out of the way. Anyways. So this is my day job, Skeptic. Here's our most recent issue on friendship and fiendship, good and evil, whatever the nature of human nature, that sort of thing. Skeptic is a quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization, which you can give us a little love at skeptic.com/donate if you wanted to do that. And that's the commercial portion of the evening. And the magazine should be carried by most Barnes & Nobles and chain bookstores, but easiest to just go to skeptic.com. We still are in print, which is unusual for magazines these days. Most of them have gone out of business, but we're and also digital and so on. Okay, so that's my day job, and then I write books and do the podcast, The Michael Shermer Show, talking to guests, mostly authors of new nonfiction books, and that's pretty much what I do for a living. So the book, so I was here 3 years ago. It takes me 3 years to write a book, so every 3 years. And the previous one was on conspiracy theories. This is kind of the general theory of the very specific idea, why do people believe conspiracy theories? And the subtitle of that was Why the Rational Believe the Irrational. And the answer in part was because for many of them, it's not irrational to believe these, to hold these beliefs. They actually believe what they say they believe. And so, I used the example, I opened this book with the people that marched on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Most of them really believed that they were doing the right thing. The election was being stolen, the country was being stolen, and so on. Some of them probably were there just to have some fun and just mix things up. Sometimes young men do that sort of thing. A lot of people are in there taking selfies. They probably weren't revolutionaries. But we know the people that were arrested and served time and then were interviewed afterwards by Nancy Pelosi's daughter, Alexandra, who did that documentary in which they said, absolutely, I believe that. I still believe it. The election was stolen. I served my time, but that was the right thing to do. So to them, it's not irrational in the same way that if, you're at work and somebody calls you and says, somebody's nosing around your house, it looks pretty suspicious. So you call the police and they drive over there and they go, well, we don't see anything. And you're like, okay. And then your neighbor calls again and says, oh, they're backing a truck up into the back of your house. It looks like they're taking your stuff. And you're like, well, I better go home. The police aren't doing anything about this, right? That would be a rational thing to do. And so people are, in a way, as I say, no one joins a cult. No one's ever joined a cult. They join a group that they think is going to be good. And then later down the line, they drink the Kool-Aid or whatever. So I start that book with that premise that, most of the beliefs that people hold, they really do believe it. There's some con people and people that say stuff just to make money or sell books or whatever. Most of the alien abductee people and the UFO people I've met, they really have had experiences that, they can't explain or they saw something. They're not just making this stuff up. Now, of course, the question is, what does it really represent? What's the truth about the claim? So the first third of the book deals with, well, in science, how do we deal with this issue? So I define truth as something confirmed to such an extent, it would be rational to offer your provisional assent. So provisional as in temporary. This is what we believe to be true now. That could change if the evidence changes, but, this is truth with a small t. This is what we think is true at the moment. And in science, that would be reasonable to offer your provisional assent if there's substantial evidence. If there isn't, then you can withhold judgment or, not declare any belief at all. So I have a whole last third of the book on what I call the known unknowables. This is, Rumsfeld, known knowns. Here's what we know about science. The known unknowns, here's the things that, we don't sure about, but we may find out, dark energy and dark matter, these are just linguistic placeholders for what we don't know at the moment. Cosmologists don't mean this as an explanation. They just say the galaxies are doing something kind of funky. They're being held together. There's not enough stuff to hold them together. So we're going to call that dark matter. But that's not an explanation. They just mean we're going to call it that until we figure out what it is, neutrinos or dark planets or whatever, So the difference between that and some of the other truths, if you want to call them that I deal with, like religious truths, when they say, God did it, they mean that's the explanation. That's the full explanation. But to me, that's an inadequate explanation. It's an explanation, but it's not a very good explanation because it doesn't explain how does it work. It would be like the astronomer saying, well, dark matter does it. But how does it do it? What is it? The inquiring mind wants to know. Scientists want to know. So in science, we are very Bayesian. So I have a chapter on Bayesian reasoning. In short, that you assign some probability of being something true between 1% and 99%. So if you have a deck of cards and you randomly flip them, red, black, it's 50-50. So the probability is, if I pull a card out of the deck, 50% black, 50% red. If I have a bag of marbles, 10 marbles, 9 are black and 1 is white, and I randomly pull a marble out, 90% probability, it's black. Okay, so that would be a simple Bayesian kind of reasoning. So with that, then you say, well, my confidence, my credence is at 90% that the marble I'll pick will be black. If it's white, well, that's one of the 10%, right? And people have a hard time with this, when in polls, when people are asked, when the weather guy says, there's a 70% chance of rain tomorrow, what does that mean? Well, it's going to rain in 70% of the city. No, it doesn't mean that. Or it'll rain 70% of the time. No, it doesn't mean that either. If they ran the data 100 times, 70 of them it rains. So if it doesn't rain, that's one of the 30. Almost nobody gets this, right? So in one of my little beefs, if I was education czar, it would be everybody learns to think statistically like in middle school, right? And so maybe at the time you're taking geometry and pre-algebra and algebra, oh, that's good. But really, do you use that versus statistics and probabilities? And, so in Bayesian reasoning, we have something called Cromwell's rule. Oliver Cromwell famously said, I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, you might be mistaken. So in Bayesian reasoning, Cromwell's rule is you never assign a 0 or a 1 to anything. just in case. So now, as you know, I'm an atheist, so I have my doubts about being a deity, but there might be a deity, but I know for sure I'm not the deity, and I know for sure you're not either. So we are fallible. So fallibilism is that, universal realism, there is a reality out there to be discovered. Fallibilism, we'll never know 100%. So somewhere between 99% and lower. So I could be right about this, I could be wrong. What do you think? So then I talk about the social nature of science. It's absolutely imperative that social institutions of trained professionals in an area decide. Now, they don't vote. It's not a democracy per se, but the people that know most about a particular subject then compete with each other and say, this is our consensus at the moment. We think X is the case. Now, we could be wrong. It could be that guy over there, because it's never 100% of the people in the community. It could be that guy might be right. The 3% that said climate change is not real, whatever. They may be right, but probably not. The consensus, 97% says this. Okay, they're probably right. But again, we might be wrong, so you never know. And, that part of the problem is the survivorship bias. You remember the hits, the Galileos that turned out to be right. And then all the other people that had their theories of everything at the time and turned out to be wrong, no one writes biographies about them. Well, some historians of science write about some weirdos, but most of the time, like when I get these papers that people send me that are alternative theories of physics, and I have hundreds of these, and they offer, look, if you'll help me with this, I'll share the Nobel Prize with you. And I'm like, look, I'm a social scientist. Really, you should go to the local high school physics guy and ask him, right? And maybe that guy's the right one, right? But the problem is there's 100 guys like that, right? So, the physicist who appears to be a flatlander, closed-minded, dogmatic, just not open to these new ideas, really, they've heard all of these. And they're busy doing their research. And so science is very conservative in that sense. By nature, it has to be, because most new ideas that people have turn out not to be right. So now it could be, right? So I'm in favor of entertaining alternative people, just in case. I mean, it's kind of my day job in a way. So when I see like Graham Hancock, the alternative archaeologist, and I appear on Rogan with him for almost 4 hours, it was a long day, talking about this ancient civilization. Not the aliens, but that the Atlanteans. This is his theory. And that, these pre-dynastic Egyptian, these are pre-Babylonian, these are like 20, 30, 40,000 years old. All right? So we go back and forth on this. Now, he keeps saying stuff keeps getting older. And he's right. That over my lifetime, things have gotten older. Like, when were the first Americans? It was like 12,000, then it was 13,000, 14, 15, 16. Now it's like 25,000 years old of these footprints in North America. And he keeps posting on X, stuff keeps getting older, you see? And I'm like, yeah, all right. But, the consensus is that we're going to go look at the footprints and date the footprints and study them, not just, pick at the anomalies. And so, what do you do with the anomalies is you sign them to a grad student to go figure it out or something like this, right? And so no theory explains all of the data. There's always an anomaly of unexplained data in any area. So the alternative people, the people that are like challenging the scientific mainstream, are really poking holes at the anomalies. Like, what about this one? What about that? What about this artifact that was found at Easter Island, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but let's put it in the larger context. Or like this morning I was on about UAPs, right? This week, Trump and Hegseth and little Marco are going to announce that, aliens are here. It's like, all right. I know. I've been hearing this since 1992 when we started Skeptic Magazine, and I've been hearing this since I was in college watching Carl Sagan talk about aliens, right? When is the big disclosure coming? And all of their focus is on, but look at this one video right here. It's a really weird thing. Yeah? And what about that video? And this guy, this farmer, he said he saw this thing, and he called the sheriff, and the sheriff saw it too. And it's always, the credentials of the people that saw the thing, the anomaly, that matters. To which I always ask, what were the credentials of the pilots that shot down the Chinese spy balloon? They're like, I don't know. It's like, I know. I don't either. Nobody cares about their credentials because we all saw the spy balloon. That's real. It's clear, unmistakable. Everybody covers it. It was announced by the president, the Secretary of Defense, the Pentagon. All the networks covered it. End of story. None of the UFO alien stuff is in that category. It's always, well, if you kind of squint and use your imagination, you could sort of see in the blurry thing here, it looks like a spaceship, which is the stuff I hear about Bigfoot. Well, I know. It was 3 a.m. and I got up and my camera wasn't quite working and I sort of took this shot. And if you use your imagination, sorry, if you want to name a new specimen in biology, you actually have to have a type specimen. Here it is. Everybody could see it, right? So in science, we all need to see it. We could be wrong, but at the very least, that's the best method we have. Okay. Then a final point on that. That in 2010, there was a replication crisis in which it became apparent that there were some serious flaws in the scientific methodology, mainly in psychology and in the medical sciences, in which, and this all began with one of our wheelhouse subjects, which was, for decades, people have been asking us skeptics, what would it take for you to believe in the paranormal? It's like, well, okay, a good start would be like an actual scientific experiment that's highly controlled, conducted by a real scientist at a real university, published in an actual peer-reviewed, highly ranked scientific journal. That would be a good place to start. So in 2010, Daryl Bem, who's a world-class social psychologist at Cornell University, publishes in the Journal of Social and Personality Psychology, one of the top journals, this study that showed that subjects, slightly more statistically significant than the other subjects, were able to tell which side of the screen the computer would put an erotic image versus a neutral image before the computer decided which side of the screen it would put the image on. All right, I said that kind of fast, but he's got the subject sitting in front of a computer screen. It's split. The 2 images will appear. One will be like a neutral landscape, and the other one an erotic image. Okay, and so then they just pick the button. Okay, I think it's going to be left, or I think it's going to be right, and then the computer. But they're deciding this before the computer has made its little random number generator click to decide which side of the screen. According to Bem, this is backward causality. They could tell before the computer even decided which side of the screen it was going to be on, all right? So I remember reading this thinking, okay, what are the chances that 400 years of physics has been overturned by a social psychologist showing porn images to college students? I mean, really. And he was on the Colbert Report, and Colbert called this extrasensory pornception. It's like, all right, so what's going on here? So then, people deconstructed the methodology. He ran 9 experiments. Only 2 of them were significant. The other were file drawered. He just put them in the file drawer, right? And everybody does this. So this is the file drawer problem. And then there's p-hacking, where you adjust the extreme values to get your p-values down to the 0.05 or down to 0.01 or whatever. Instead at 0.06 where it's at, I got to throw out this one and I get it down. And everybody does this, right? And there was a bunch of things like that. So people point this out to me, and then they started the follow up on that. Stuart Russell and Richard Wiseman replicated that exact experiment by Bem, sent their null results to the same journal, who then turned them down and said, "We're not interested in null results," because to be a popular journal, you have to have new, exciting research of new findings. And no findings is not of interest. So this was a problem. Okay, so now science critics point all these things out, and half of all these famous psych experiments, if you hold your pen this way versus this way, it makes you laugh at jokes more. Or if you hold a cold glass of water and I meet you, or versus a warm glass of water and I meet you, I'm more likely to judge you as warmer or colder. If you stand at the top of the escalator, you donate more money than at the bottom of the escalator. If you have a clean desk top or a clean desk, you'll donate more money than not, on and on. None of these were replicated. Amy Cuddy's, power pose. I was at the TED Talk where she gave this power pose talk. You got to have your shoulders back and your chin up and get in there and ask for the raise. And, everyone afterwards was walking around in a power pose, right? But no one was able to replicate the power pose. And she got a big book contract and speaking engagements at corporations, teach my employees how to be a power poser. And so science critics point this out. You guys got this wrong and this wrong and this wrong. But to that I say, yeah, but all this was discovered by other scientists. That's how it works. It's the scientists that point out these errors. It's the whistleblowers, usually grad students working in the lab going, I saw my professor, he was kind of doing these things. That didn't look too right, right? And then they tell somebody. And, so that's how it's discovered. I saw this back in the 80s when we were covering the intelligent design, creationism, and all that stuff. And Steve Gould pointed out that, the creationists would point out like, the scientists fell for Piltdown Man, and they fell for this fossil that turned out to be a horse fossil and not a human fossil. And they have this like laundry list of anomalies that scientists got wrong. But as Gould pointed out, it was the scientists who discovered those errors, not the creationists, right? That's how it works, right? So you're constantly in error, and then you find something in error, and so on and so forth. Anyway, okay, so then in the second part of the book, I talk about, I apply a lot of this to religion, mythology, miracles, coincidences, apparently synchronicity, these sorts of things, and show that, in fact, if you really do a statistical analysis and the law of large numbers, if you have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people doing billions of things every day, a really unusual day would be one in which nothing unusual happened. And so, but our brains are not wired to understand randomness. So, to most of us, the world looks very clustered, and things are like happening, like in conspiracy theories. Oh, this happened and this happened. That can't be chance. Actually, that is chance. Right. So my favorite example of that is when Steve Jobs introduced the shuffle feature for the iPod. This will randomly play the songs on your playlist. And then customers complain, it's not random. Certain songs come up more than others. Like, that's randomness. And so they had to reprogram the shuffle feature to be non-random so that people would think that it's random, right? So the stars in the sky that are in constellations, that's randomness. You throw the 100 pennies up in the air and they fall on the floor. They're not perfectly distributed. If they were perfectly distributed, there'd be some force operating to make that happen. But they're clustered, and that's randomness. But we don't understand that, so we pick out the really highly unusual things. Actually, I'll just read you an example of that because it's rather amusing. If you just give me a second here, Martin Gardner, of these really unusual, 133, here we go. All right. So one of the founders of the modern skeptics movement is Martin Gardner, who had the column in Scientific American before I did. Let's see. Hang on. Okay. All right, sorry. And by the way, there was 214 consecutive monthly columns in Scientific American. Not that I'm counting or anything. The record was by Steve Gould. He had 300, and I wanted to break that record, but that's a long story. Sorry, just 133, 134. Okay, it has to be here. All right. Okay. Oh, no. Okay, Anthony Hopkins. Sorry, let me try this other one here. Okay, because this is a crazy story. Okay. Oh, 90, 91. Okay, here it is. So these are highly unusual events. How to think about coincidences. All right. So here's an example from skeptic and science writer Martin Gardner. One day, Martin was perusing a used bookstore when he came across a familiar title. His father had given him a copy of that book when he was a child, but he lost it during a move many years prior. As he considered purchasing this replacement copy, Gardner flipped through the pages and found his own handwritten notes in the margins. It was the very book Gardner had lost. An even spookier coincidence happened to the actor Anthony Hopkins, who in 1972 was signed to star in the film adaptation of George Pfeiffer's novel, The Girl from Petrovka. Hopkins went to several London booksellers to purchase a copy, but none had it in stock. Heading for home, he chanced upon a book on a bench at the Leicester Square tube station. Unbelievably, it was The Girl from Petrovka. 2 years later, when Hopkins met Pfeiffer and mentioned the coincidence to him, the author noted that he had lent his last copy to a friend with handwritten edits in it for the American edition, changing, for example, labor, O-U-R, to labor, O-R. For example. When Hopkins flipped open his copy, he saw Pfeiffer's annotation. It was the very same book. Okay, that's pretty weird. Yeah, I will admit that's weird. Okay, given the propensity for humans to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise, what I call patternicity and so forth, Many people see in this Carl Jung synchronicity, Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance. Rupert's the guy that thinks your dog knows when you're coming home randomly, or that it's easier to solve the New York Times puzzle later in the afternoon on Sunday than earlier because more people have solved it and it's in the quantum ether or whatever, this kind of stuff. So, in fact, so I'm quoting here from a statistician named Hand. Such paranormal supernatural explanations are unnecessary. Hand recounts Hopkins' book story, plus dozens of equally unlikely events, to illustrate why, in a world as vast as ours and with so many possible events in the offing, the extraordinarily unlikely must happen. Events of vanishingly small probability will occur. There are laws of probability at work here, says Hand, starting with the law in inevitability. Let's see, I just do a back of the envelope calculation here. According to Google Books, there are about 130 million book titles in the world. If the average print run was around 5,000 copies each, that totals 650 billion books. With a world literacy rate of 84%, that means around 5.9 billion people are reading some of these 650 billion books. It would be miraculous if someone, somewhere, sometime did not find a surprising connection of some sort with one of the books. So, of course, you remember, how come Hopkins didn't find Silence of the Lambs on the, right? Of course, we wouldn't, you only notice the ones that happen. Okay, so then I apply all that to some religious claims, like so. Then I kind of shift to some of these maybe impossible to answer. It's hard to say, but difficult. Free will and determinism, consciousness, why there's something rather than nothing, and the whole God religion question. So before that, I explore the idea that maybe there's subjective internal truths for me. I like dark chocolate. You like milk chocolate, whatever. Maybe you like dark chocolate. but there's no right answer to that. It's just my preference. You have your preference, whatever. And, so those, or like people I know that say, there's this other world out there. They're spiritual, but not religious. And if you take this ayahuasca, you will see these spirit beings that I see. Now, I haven't done this yet. And I probably won't, but maybe I will. Anyway, and I say, well, okay, there's these other spirit beings. How do you know they're there? Well, if you take the ayahuasca, you'll see. It's like, yeah, but it's still in my head. And so the evidence is take the ayahuasca. It's like, okay, that's still stuck in my head. For it to be a scientific truth, empirical claim of some kind, you have to be able to see it. You, and I just point to it, right? This is in that realm of the other world, this sort of paranormal, supernatural, this ephemeral world that it's hard to say what it is, if it's anything. So what are religious claims? Here I'm trying to be a little nicer than I've been as an old school atheist of saying, maybe religious truths, excuse me, are like literary truths. So I use examples of, what makes a Jane Austen novel a great novel, or a Dostoevsky novel, or, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Is there really a Middle Earth? Now, I'm told if you go to New Zealand that you'll see something like the Middle Earth there. But to ask that question is missing the point of the story. They're just made up stories. The characters are made up, the plot's made up, but it represents a deeper truth about human nature and the human condition and human relations, and Jane Austen novels about, jealousy and power and lying and deception and love and jealousy and all that stuff. All that's true. And there's now a study within evolutionary psychology of evolutionary literature. Like, let's look at great literature to see what makes it great. And it touches on these deep themes that come up everywhere. That's part of human nature, okay? So maybe mythical truths are like that, and maybe religious truths are like that. They're not literally true. So we get these articles people send to Skeptic, like, maybe the flood thing, or the parting of the Red Sea, maybe it was an earthquake, or maybe a meteor strike, or maybe this volcano erupted. Maybe it never happened. And they're just made up stories that have some other message to them, some moral homily. And there's also a whole story about Jesus. It's called the swoon theory. Have you heard of this? The swoon. So he's on the cross, and he doesn't actually die. He just kind of faints. He swoons, and they give him something. When they stab him in the side, that they've actually given him a little, anesthetic or something. And he conks out, and then they put him in this cold tomb for 3 days, where he wakes up. And then if you want to go full Dan Brown, he goes off to France with Mary Magdalene to get married and have kids. And actually, Dan Brown really stole that idea from a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail in the 1970s. And those authors who meant it, they're sort of like a Graham Hancock sort of alternative history. And their whole theory about Christianity was a nonfiction book. And they sued Brown. And I think if I recall, they lost that lawsuit, if I recall, because Brown said, I just made it up. It's a made-up story, right? As a novelist, which reminds me of the J.Z. Knight, who was the channeler in Seattle, who was really big in the 90s. She was channeling Ramtha, the 35,000-year-old guru that spoke English with an Indian accent, wherever that was, 35,000 years ago. And so she would go and she'd have a group like this, and then go into a trance, and then out would come this deep voice of Ramtha. I insist you all love one another. Oh, he wants us to love one another. Wow, that's really deep. Right. Anyway, all this stuff. And then this German psychic started channeling Ramtha. She's like, oh, no. I'm the only one that gets to channel Ramtha. And she goes, but if Ramtha actually exists, then anybody can channel Ramtha. And she's like, but yeah. And anyway, so it reminds me a little bit of that. Okay, so I've been trying out the religious stories as mythical truths. And the Christians will go with me some of the way, like the story of Jonah in the whale. Jonah gets swallowed by this great fish, doesn't say whale, great fish, and is in the belly of the whale for 3 days and then spit out on this other land. And then delivers the message. Okay, whatever that was. And so skeptics are like, how does somebody live in a whale and a great fish for 3 days without... Okay, you're missing the point of the story. This never actually happened. The story is about what happened when he went from here to there, and he delivers the message of redemption or whatever it was. And the 3 days is symbolic, like Jesus in the tomb for 3 days. It's very Old Testament. Okay. And so a lot of Christians will go, yeah, okay, yeah, it never happened. Yeah. So of course, it's a deeper truth. And so I'll get some of the way there. And then, but when it comes to the resurrection, because I say, maybe it never happened. Because if you actually treat it as an empirical truth, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. How many people have ever lived? About 100 billion, we're told by demographers. And there's about 8 billion alive now. Okay, so not one of them has come back from the dead, except maybe one. This guy, the carpenter from Nazareth. Maybe he's the one. So is the evidence for the resurrection commensurate with that? 100 billion to 1. Is it like 100 billion to 1? Probability that this happened on a Bayesian scale? No, it's not even remotely close. It's not even as good as like Pompeii and Vesuvius and all that, which is, standard, tons of evidence that this happened. You can go there and see it. Okay, there's nothing like that for the resurrection. To which I said, well, maybe it never happened. Maybe you're missing the point. Maybe the story has to do with redemption and starting over and being born again. And, what Jews believe about the Messiah. And the Old Testament prophesies that the Messiah would come as a conquering warrior. He would conquer the Romans, reestablish Israel as a sovereign nation, and the Jews would be, born again, as it were, and so on. That's what it means. Well, so far, this is not going over really well. It's like, hang on. No. This one literally happened. And we have to believe that, I'm told by Christians. We have to believe this. That's what it means to be a Christian. Paul himself says, if Christ has not risen, and then we are not born again, then we are in sin, and there's no point in being a Christian. To which I say, well, okay, then then be a Jew, or don't be anything, But so they kind of stop there at that point. Why that is, I'm not sure. Maybe some of you will have thoughts on this. Could be because we live in an age of science. You're supposed to have evidence for your claims, and that it's not enough. Why is it not enough to just say, look, this is what I believe. You believe what you believe. This is what works for me. And I'm okay with that. I've had on my podcast a number of these guys Like Charles Murray, the bell curve guy. He found God at age 82. His wife is religious. He found God. He wrote a book about it. And here's all the reasons why I now believe in God. I had him on my podcast, to which I asked him, okay, you're 82 years old, cramming for the final? which he liked. And, he had his reasons. Well, the Big Bang and the something from nothing and the fine tuning of the universe. And, and then he went through the miracles of this and that, the New Testament and Jesus and the whole thing. It's like, okay, it's one thing to say, look, my wife's religious. It works for me. I feel much better about it. Because Martin Gardner, I mentioned, he was a fideist, F-I-D-E-I-S-T, a pragmatist. That is, William James, Miguel Unamuno, and one other philosopher that he admired were fideists. They believed that on big questions like free will and determinism, the existence of God, why there's something rather than nothing, and so on, those big ones, when science can't decide one way or the other for sure, it's okay to just do whatever you want to do. Pragmatically speaking, there's a pragmatic truth. If it works for you, it changes your life, it's okay to believe. Not that Uri Geller can bend spoons with his mind. Forget that. Just the big questions. Okay, this is what he said he believed. And this came out in Skeptic. I interviewed him, and I'm like, what? And then people like Randy are like, what? Martin he believes in God. Yeah, but Martin was clear about this. I'm not saying you should believe. I'm not even saying that we have good arguments. In fact, the atheists have slightly better arguments than the theists do. I'm just saying it works for me. At which point I just say, okay. The same thing happened with, I've told this story on the podcast about myself and Richard Dawkins on stage with Ken Miller. Ken Miller was the leading debunker of intelligent design creationism, all the business about the bacterial flagellum and DNA from RNA in the eye and all this stuff. He debunked all that. He's a microbiologist. He goes, here's how it actually works, and so on. In the last chapter of his book, he says, and by the way, I'm a Catholic, and I accept Jesus as my Savior and the whole thing. And it's like, all right, so we're at this conference on science and religion. Three of us are up on stage, and, Richard is like, okay, I'm going to get this guy. Richard. He's like, all right. And he's like, all right, Ken, let's say we found a piece of the true cross. There it is. And on the piece of the true cross is a little bit of flesh, and we were able to extract the DNA from the flesh. And, Jesus was supposedly born a virgin. And Ken just goes, Richard, I'm not saying any of this is true. I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. That's it. I'm not saying you should believe or there's any evidence for it. And it's like, okay. So in other words, he's saying, I'm putting this in this bin over here. It's a completely different bin than science. All right, what do you do with that? I don't know. I mean, you could just set it aside, right? For me, it's not enough to tilt over into belief, but for some people it is. So I've kind of sort of made peace with religion that way, I guess. Apparently for some people it's important. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, as you know, one of the great atheist champions of women's rights and so on of our generation, has found God. And she got baptized. She's a total believer in Jesus as her Savior, the whole thing right now. And there's a very personal story about this. She's spoken publicly about it, how saved her life. She's under death threat from Islam and all these horrible things. And so this saved her life. She'll go into details about this in her book. To which I haven't seen her book yet, to which I say, okay, if that works for you, okay. Whatever it takes. I don't know what it's like to live for 30 years under a death threat. So, maybe that's the way it is. But the moment then somebody says, like I just did a big debate at Ohio State with Ross Douthat from the New York Times. His book is called Believe. Subtitle, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. It's like, okay, believe, okay. Why you should also believe? Hang on. Hold on now. Now you're saying it's not in this bin, it's over here in the empirical bin. In that case, I'm going to ask, what's your evidence? And then he goes through the arguments. Yeah, I know, but the fine tuning, but here's our answers to that. The existence of something rather than nothing. Yeah, but here's the answers to that. I go through all those in the book. And he's like, yeah, okay, those are good arguments. Like, I know. So, if you need to believe, okay, I understand. Like one time I tell this story about meeting Isaac Hayes, the great Grammy Award-winning Theme from Shaft guy, right? Then he was on South Park. He was Chef, the voice of Chef. And by chance, he was friends with my best friend, Michael Coles, in Atlanta. So I go back there for Thanksgiving. This is late 90s. And I'm sitting across the table from Isaac Hayes. There he is. I'm like, oh my God. And he was a big Scientologist. This was in all the papers, Scientology, wow. Okay. So I have a chance to ask Isaac Hayes about Scientology, which we were debunking in Skeptic. But I didn't want to be a dick about it. I'm like, okay, so Isaac, what do they do for you? And he said, well, Michael, I'll tell you, I was at the top of the game in Hollywood, Grammy Award winner, all this stuff, I had money, women, drugs, everything you want. And then I lost everything and I'm down in the dumps. I got nothing. And Scientology saved my life. Like, okay, end of conversation. I mean, really, I'm not going to tell this guy, that's all right. That's sort of my attitude about that. Pick your battles. If somebody says I should believe, okay, then time out. Then, okay, now we're talking on my terror. Somebody says, look, it's just something that's personal to me. I put it in that bin of subjective, like dark chocolate. Well, okay, whatever, right? Something like that. Anyway, then I finished the book up. I talk about consciousness, free will, why there's something rather than nothing. And then, so there I'll just briefly mention, on consciousness, so the easy problem of consciousness, so-called easy problem is, what's the wiring for whatever? Like if you want to see red, there's the back of the occipital lobe and there's an area there that sees red and it gets transduced to this and that and the neurons do everything. The wiring acts a certain way. Okay, that's the easy problem and they've figured out a lot of those problems, but there's a ways to go. The hard problem appears to be, what's it like to be the wiring? And I've thought a lot about this. I've read all these books on it. I've had all these guys on my podcast. And it's like, okay, what's it like to be a bat? Thomas Nagel's famous paper. What's it like to be a bat? How the hell should I know? I'm a person, right? Now, I could imagine, having some echolocation and maybe I'm in a little closet and I could sort of hear which directions. But I'm still a person. I'm still me. And at some point, if I really knew what it was like to be a bat, I would just be a bat, not wondering what it's like to be a bat. And so the whole thing is premised on a dualism, as if the little homunculus in my brain goes off into the brain of the bat and goes, oh, this is what it looks like. That can't happen, right? Much like Freaky Friday, where Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan switch bodies and hilarity ensues, right? Okay, you are your body. There's no switching bodies, right? I mean, that's it. There's just the one stuff, okay? But the consciousness people seem to want there to be something else. And if you look on Wikipedia, there's like 25 different theories of the hard problem of consciousness. So to me, that signals, okay, these guys don't know what they're talking about. These philosophers, neuroscientists, they can't agree, and it could just be a conceptual problem. What's it like to be the wiring is the wrong question. I don't know how you'd answer that scientifically. Free will and determinism, I'm a compatibilist like Dan Dennett. I think the past is determined. The future is not determined yet. It's not predetermined. We are part of the causal net, self-determining what happens to ourselves in part going forward. Heraclitus says you can't step into the same river twice. It's not the same river. You're not the same person going forward. Could you have done otherwise? Well, if it's replay the tape and play it back, could you have done otherwise? If it's a tape of what you actually did, then no. That's the tape of what you actually did, right? But going forward, there's no environment in the future that's exactly like the past. It's not possible. And you are part of the causal net, so you're making decisions like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to go right instead of left because yesterday I went left and that didn't work out. So this is called learning. Okay. Anyway, this is my compatibilist workaround. Most of the hardcore determinists are not vibing this at all. And so I'm kind of getting hammered on this. But anyway, maybe this is one of those unknowables. Again, it's the way it's conceived. What do you mean by choice? What do you mean by volition? What do you mean by free? What do you mean by determined or self-determined? These are words, okay? And then finally, I sort of end with a speculation that, in the far future, if we do discover aliens, I have a whole chapter on aliens, but anyway, if we ever discovered aliens, they would not just be 5 years ahead of us. Like, you hear these stories, it crashed at Roswell. By the way, how is it that the aliens are able to traverse the vast distances of interstellar space and they keep crashing into Mexico, right? I mean, what is it going on with these? Okay. And we back engineered their technology, and out of that we got these new silicon computer chips from the old vacuum tubes of the World War II computers. Okay, as if the aliens were just like that far ahead of us, right? That's not going to happen. Just the vast distances, and there's we're about 4.5 billion years here on Earth. There could have been a whole nother generation, billions of years ahead of us easily, and so the chance of them being close to us, they'd be 1 million years ahead of us. They would appear like deities. All right. So to me, the whole alien thing, it's very much like religion. Out there somewhere is this super advanced, super moral, super intelligent being that knows we're here and is monitoring us. Okay, it's the oldest story in the book. It's what all religions are based on. It's what the 1951 film, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Remember that film, right? Okay, it's a Christ allegory, right? So Klaatu is the Jesus character who comes from down on high to deliver to the Earthlings this message. In this case, it was nuclear weapons. The remake with Keanu Reeves was about global warming, of course, and. So he can't get the attention of the authorities. So he mingles among the common people. He has a relationship, sort of, with Renee. What was her name? Michael Rennie and Patricia Neal. So she was sort of the Mary Magdalene character. And then he's hunted down by the authorities when they find out who he is, and then they kill him, and they put him in a tomb. Right? And then Gort the robot, she has to go to the Gort the robot who's at that soccer field or whatever and give him the most famous message in the history of science fiction. Gort, Klaatu, Barado, Nikto. Did I get that right? Nikto, yeah. Right. And then so that's the message to Gort, like, go get him. So he goes and gets him, burns a hole, drags him off, takes him back to the ship, lays him down on that platform, does some stuff with the lights, and he comes back alive. Now, I looked this up. One of my science fiction friends looked this up and said in the original script, he goes, yeah, that's the power we have. We could resurrect the dead, right? But the Breen Censorship Board in 1951 said, we can't tell American people that there's only one religion allowed to do that. So they changed it. Now in the movie, you'll see he says something like, no. Only the Great Spirit in the sky is allowed to do that. We're just temporarily bringing things back to life. Like, oh, okay. Anyway, and then he delivers his message and he sends to heaven in the spaceship. Okay, it's the oldest story in the book. So if we did find aliens, they would be to us like deities, or then my final speculation, far future humans. I mean, the way AI is going, and then AGI and so on, we're here. I mean, it's happening, I think, finally. We've been publishing articles since the early days of Skeptic, and we're 5 years away and always will be. That joke appears to now be over. But anyway, just carry it out, 50,000 years of more AI or whatever, it would be omniscient-like. Anyway, so that's where I end. Okay, thank you. I'll take some questions now. Thank you.
Greetings. Can everyone hear me? So in reference to people always being America or the northern United States, etc., Pangea, basics. The conspiracy theory of history is also known, aka the cause and effect theory of history, but that means that there's someone planning things at the top of the superstructure or whatever. And a lot of people are like, well, no, accidents happen, so it's a combination of both, logically. Because I've been in the Western medical system since I was 8 years old with my first head trauma, I've been noticing over the past, 22 years at least, that statistical narratives are replacing formal explanation of the phenomena utilizing the nine-step scientific method. In the book, I still haven't read it. I'm waiting for it. I looked at the introduction and the conclusion, and I believe it's in the 80s or 90s. I forget. There's a guy's face on it, but it's called Something to Believe In. And it's on my phone, but I found a document in black and white on the ground in the Mission District, and it's got lists of scientists who believe in God, 30 of them. I sent that to everybody. I'm sure they're alienated by now. Yeah, just want to share.
Okay, yeah. So there are scientists that believe in God. Can scientists believe in God? Sure. Of course. I mean, they do. Now, statistically speaking, scientists are less likely to believe in God than non-scientists, and the most elite scientists are the least likely to believe in God. I'm just giving you the studies that have shown this, okay? But obviously, you have Francis Collins as an example of this. But again, I think what people are doing, like Ken Miller, they're just separating it in different bins. I call those logic-tight compartments. They're just keeping it separate over here. They don't do religion. Okay, so here's the example that I use in the book. If the preacher says to the congregation that the church has a parking lot in the back, well, you can see for yourself if there's a parking lot or not. Afterwards, you go check. But when the preacher says, look, God is 3 in 1, 1 in 3, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the average person is going, whatever. Okay, if that's what we believe, that's what we believe. Let those theologians work out the details of that, something like that. I think the average person doesn't really give it much thought. And I think that's mostly what happens to most people.
So what do you think are the prospects in the future going forward of a greater percentage of our population being capable of critical thinking and determining what is truth? Because the number of people believing things which don't fall well into that category seems to be far greater than I would have thought by now, as our society has supposedly improved education, et cetera.
Well, I don't think, I agree. That would be good. I just don't think the education system is designed to really do that. I really think that it would be good to teach middle school kids basic critical thinking things, the stuff that we do at Skeptic, but really basic stuff. Use UFOs and Bigfoot and all the fun stuff, paranormal and magic, and kids would love that. I think they would get that, and also basic probabilities and statistics. Again, or how the economy works. I mean, people they have no idea. I mean, I meet adults, people my age have no idea how the stock market works. It's like, oh my God, you should be getting this in school, right? So I think that's a problem. We do know from courses that teach students, and these are undergraduates, how to think critically and what the cognitive biases are to look for. Confirmation bias, hindsight bias, mindsight bias, and so on. They get really good at spotting those in speeches and other students and so on. They still have a hard time seeing it in themselves. So this is called the bias, right? Everybody else has biases but me, right? So that's really, in a way, sort of the my side bias. And that's prevalent, right? So now in politics or the law, journalism, they have methods, like in journalism, fact checking, and many layers of editors. So I had a piece 2 weeks ago in the Washington Post just before all the cuts. Bezos cut everybody. So it was just an excerpt from the Alien chapter, right? So it's like a 10,000 word chapter. It's like an 800 word excerpt. It's nothing, right? And this book has already been fact-checked by the editors at Johns Hopkins University Press, and I fact-checked it. And still, I sent, maybe 6 links with the 800 words. They go, that's not enough. We need a link for this and this and this. So I ended up like 12 links in an 800 word. And then 2 other editors went through it, and I thought, this is a real pain in the ass here. Come on. And then I thought, actually, this is good, right? This is somebody's following up and checking. So when I read something about Ukraine or Gaza or whatever, I think, well, somebody hopefully went through that. So when I read it, it's like, I don't know anything about that. So I'm hoping that works. Now, in independent journalism, which I like, and I know a lot of these guys, I know they don't have fact checkers. It's just the one guy. There's no editors like, are you sure you should say that? And so a lot of the stuff they say, like this one guy, I talked to somebody in Marco Rubio's office about the aliens, and they told me this, like, who did you speak to? Well, I can't tell you. And I have no way of knowing if this guy just made this up. But in an editorial office, I know, well, at least somebody knows. He can't just make it up, right? Hopefully. Anyway, so, and in politics, in a way, I guess an election is like a scientific experiment. So for a while, like, what's the right percentage of immigration we should allow? There's no right number. This party wants to allow more in, this party wants to allow less in. And so the election is going to put one in power and see what happens. It's not perfect like science, but it's the best we got at the moment.
One of the challenges I've heard is that the average American has a 6th grade reading level.
Well, I've heard 8th grade, but I don't know, whatever. It's not good.
Michael. Thank you for talking about the truth. And as AI becomes more and more prevalent, and we have so many things that can spoof other things, and people just believe them because it looks real. And if you want to believe that Barack Obama said a particular thing, even though he certainly never did, what is your advice for making sure that people know what the objective truth is? How do you find that, and how do you make sure that you promote that instead of just believing whatever you just happen to see on the internet?
Yeah, it's really hard. You have to have multiple sources. And the more the better if you have time. That's the problem. So I'm old school. You use the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, add them up, divide by 2. That's the truth. Something like that. That's no longer the case. I just have multiple sources. And that's expensive. I subscribe to a bunch of these Substackers. I want to support them. And, when I get my monthly bill, there's my Amex bill. And it's like, well, there's Hulu, Disney, HBO, and I got, Amazon Prime and Netflix. And then this guy, Substack, and then I got Barry Weiss's Free Press, and and all of a sudden it's like, this is getting expensive. But I don't know what the solution is, because you can't trust any one of them. And so, yeah. Now, in the case of, like, Obama said this about aliens or whatever, it's usually best, and I make this error too, waiting before you post, and just, or maybe just plug into Grok or Gemini or Claude. What's your question? And then see, what did Obama say about aliens? And then you'll get half a dozen sources, and you can go to the sources. Unfortunately, that takes time. It's just easier on X to just post. And then they have the community notes going, Shermer should have checked this, because here's what it actually says. I've had that. Everybody does, right? So that you have to do. In the case of Obama, he sort of walked it back. He just got caught off guard. Are aliens real? Yeah. I never saw them, but yeah, they're real. Then he later said, well, what I meant was, out there somewhere in the cosmos, there's probably intelligent life, which is, any scientist would say that. Yeah, probably. Yeah, and that's all he meant. But of course, the UFO people go crazy about that. Like, oh my God, the president said it. Well, they've all said this, Carter, Clinton, they've all said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And then they try, and then they don't find anything. And the UFO people are like, this goes even higher than I thought. Right? Even the president doesn't know. And now Representative Luna is saying they're actually interdimensional beings, so they're invisible. And so the lack of evidence is proof that they exist, right? Really, that's the argument. Or again, in response to my constantly bugging them online about how come the videos are always grainy and blurry and you can't see what's going on. Now the answer is because they're using like a warp drive, and there's like this quantum bubble around the spaceship as it's moving through warp space, and that's why it's blurry. Honestly, this is their answer. Okay.
I've never seen an alien, but I've seen 3 UFOs with 2 other people.
All right. Yes, sir. Hang on.
Is the skeptic related in some way to an earlier publication that I think was called The Skeptical Inquirer?
Yes, they're still around. Yeah.
They're different.
Yeah, we're different. Yeah.
Okay.
You've heard of Science Magazine and Nature Magazine? They're different. And that's okay.
Hi. I heard you on Brian Lehrer's show on WNYC.
Yes, okay. All
and
right.
his response was pretty surprising. And I wanted to know what you thought about his response. Like, what would generate that kind of, it seemed almost like panic to me.
Okay, so the very first day the book came out, the very first show I did was this WNYC. It's the largest public radio show in the country. Brian Lehrer's their top host guy, right? I don't know anything about him. And so we're just going through all the stuff that I've been going through with you. And then he said, all right, we're going to go to the phones. And we're going to Mabel in wherever it was, Trenton. Mabel in Trenton. She's like, well, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and, I've had it with the Trump administration, and the country is blah, blah, blah. And he's like, yeah. And then she goes, but I have to tell you, my own party is really disappointing. They have this whole thing about how women can become men and men can be pregnant. And I've just had it with this. This is nonsense. And he's like, what, wait, what? And I just said, yeah, I agree. That's And it's time we called it clear, right? And the Democrats are not helping themselves by going down this road. This is not good. And he just went, yeah, he was not happy about this at all. Apparently he thinks whatever he thinks about the whole trans thing. And then, excuse me, after the end of the interview, and unbeknownst to me, he then goes to the phones. If you disagree with Dr. Shermer, call us up and let him have it. And they did. I heard the rest of it later, the next day. I went, he did what? So I listened to the rest of the show, and they're like, that Shermer guy's a total crackpot. Doesn't he know that men can get pregnant? And it's like, okay, all right. All righty. Now, on that particular issue, I will say, because the reference was to the interview the week before with Josh Hawley, who's interviewing that gynecologist, who is apparently very liberal, and he's very conservative, and he says, can men get pregnant? And she cannot answer this question. This is astonishing. I mean, why not just say, look, I would have been snarky. I would have said, no, Senator, men cannot get pregnant. Why are you asking? I mean, what's going on in your life here? And that would have set him back, Or if you want to be sympathetic about it, you could say, well, look, I have some patients who are women that identify as men. And I'm just there to help people. That's my job as a doctor. I'm not there to judge them. If they want to call themselves men, fine. Can they become pregnant? Yeah, they're women. But they're not men. That would have ended it. That would have been the end of the story. But no, she rambled on, and he kept asking her, I don't know. Who am I to judge? Come on. It's like the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Jackson Brown. What is a woman? Oh, I'm not a biologist. Really? You're a Supreme Court justice, and you don't know what a woman is? Really? You can't answer? Come on. This is not good for the Democrats. This is not good. Right? And so anyway, I thought that would all change within the last year. I don't even have a chapter. There's nothing in the book about this, because I figured by the time this book comes out, this will be ancient history, right? No, it hasn't. Anyway, so okay. Yeah.
I don't expect you to read his mind, but no serious astrophysicist believes that going to Mars, putting men on Mars, humans on Mars, is survivable. Putting a colony there is not survivable, and yet Musk is funding this. What do you think he's got? What's wrong with this guy?
But I saw that movie, The Martian. If you grow potatoes, apparently you can. Yeah. No, I'm told by most astronomers say it's just like living at the top of Mount Everest would be way easier. Okay, so apparently the obstacles are huge. I don't know Elon personally. I mean, he's just out there. Yeah, I mean, does great stuff and he does crazy stuff. And I think this is probably just one of those crazy ideas. I think he'll probably end up just going back to the moon, taking his super rocket ship, whatever he calls that. Anyway, when that thing is online, I think it'll probably just go to the moon, something like that. If they want to go to Mars, I mean, there's tons of people that say, I'll go. And to which I'm like, all right, go for it. I'm staying in Santa Barbara. Sorry.
Hi.
Yep.
Yeah, you know the book *Sapiens*, I'm assuming?
Yes. Yeah.
There was an idea in there that's kind of stuck with me that social fiction and a certain degree of credulity was actually, an advantageous change, for certain groups, so they could form bigger alliances and that sort of thing. So I'm just curious if, your thoughts on how deep that wiring goes in terms of, the importance of believing things without evidence for group cohesion. And I think that's something we're up against with truth.
Well, okay, so there's two theories in cognitive psychology about reason and rationality. Why are we able to do this? So one theory is veridical perception, so that we have a better understanding of reality. Okay, obviously some of that has to be true. The other argument, Hugo de Vries and Dan Sperber, I think, their book on reason, Evolution of Reason, I forget the title of it, is that we evolved the capacity to reason to win arguments for our side, our tribe. And that our brains are more like lawyers than scientists. Just think about the job of the lawyer is to win the case for their client. Their job is not to find out what actually happened. That is not their job. I saw Alan Dershowitz interviewed by Barry Weiss a couple weeks ago or months ago, in which she asked him, how many of your clients were guilty? He's like, all of them. I mean, I'm an appellate attorney. By the time they get to me, they've been found guilty, and they're probably all guilty. That's not my job. My job is to get them off. That's what I do. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, that's good to remember, right? And It's like the Chris Rock bit about. I think it was Chris Rock. Yeah, if he ever got really in trouble with the law, he'd hired Johnny Cochran, and then his friends are like, "Oh, but people will think you're guilty." He goes, "Yeah, but you get to go home." Okay, so it's something like that. I think this is the argument that our brains are really wired to, once you glom onto an idea, that's what we believe, and then everything just goes right into gear. I'm going to defend that to the death. Okay, and that is true for beliefs that we hold that are part of our identity. I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, I'm a Catholic, or whatever. These are the doctrines. Maybe there's a little flexibility there, but if you stray too much, you're a flip-flopper, you're not really one of our tribe. So I think there's some truth to both of those theories. And then a final point on that. Like in the book, I quote Andrew Stuhlman at Occidental College, who was my colleague when I taught there. And he did research on, for example, asking undergraduates, do you accept or believe in Darwin's theory of evolution? Oh, yeah. All right, explain it. Well, the giraffe stretches its neck for the leaves and the baby giraffes have longer necks. No, that isn't it at all. So his interpretation is that they're signaling publicly, yeah, the scientists, they usually get it right. It's probably true. And that turns out to be the case for almost everything, for all of us, right? Like NAFTA. What is NAFTA? Oh, it's the North America something trade. I forget who's in it, right? But people say they're for it or against it. They don't even really know what it is, right? And even simple stuff like, can you draw a bicycle? Oh, yeah. No, I can because that's what I do. But most people go, oh, yeah, I could draw a bicycle. All right, here. Well, the pedals are, no, that's not where the pedals go. Oh, or can you explain how a zipper works? Oh, yeah, no problem. Okay, explain it. Well, the doohickey with the thingy and, So most of what, we signal, comes from sources, other sources that we just trust. So my more serious example is the 2020 election, was it rigged? I never personally went to any of the polling stations to look to see what the ballots look like. There's that video of the one in Phoenix, and they pulled up in the back of the building at 3 a.m, and they had those boxes. Ooh, what was in the box? I didn't do any of that. But Attorney General Bill Barr did, and he's in charge of the Department of Justice, and he's a lifelong Republican and a twice Trump voter, and he said, I didn't see anything. We looked into it. There was nothing to it. I thought, okay, I don't really need to give this much thought. I don't have to fact check it. I can just offload that. Most of what we believe, we offload on institutions because who has time to fact check everything? You don't.
We have time for one more question.
Some time ago, there was trigonometry podcast. And Konstantin Kisin asked you about Epstein death. Was it murder or was it suicide?
Oh, okay.
And at the time you told that for sure it was suicide. About now, you are the same?
My mind, yes.
Yeah.
This is the Epstein question. I think he killed himself. Yeah. Well, the reason for the first thing was, first of all, he died. Okay, and then one of the cameras was out, and I thought, that's a little weird, but things happen. And then the second camera was out, and I thought, it's a little fuzz. So I posted on Twitter. I mean, Twitter, come on, but I did, and I thought, okay, maybe there's something to it. After that, somebody wrote me and said, I used to work at that prison. Nothing works there. The place is a dump, and the employees that work there are like the lowest of the low. They're half asleep, not paying attention. And I thought, okay, never mind. Yeah. And I now that we know, I just think he had this life, and then he saw that was over, and people do commit suicide. I mean, it's like 45,000 a year, and I think he's just one of them.
Okay. Our gratitude to Dr. Shermer for being with us today. We're also grateful to the audience here.
Thank you.
As well as those listening to the recording. And now, this meeting of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California, commemorating its 122nd year of enlightened discussion, is adjourned. I have no idea where the gavel is, so... That's Gonzo.
Okay, there it is. Okay. I don't know what happened to it. I had it.